All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to episode 53 of PatristiCast. I'm your host, John Solheid. I'm very happy today to have on Dr. Philip Abbott to talk about his book, Sounds for a New World: The Christianizing Landscapes of Late Antiquity. Dr. Abbott is Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at Brigham Young University. Dr. Abbott, thank you for joining PatristiCast.
Thanks for having me on.
So, you know, uh, before I hit record here, I was just kind of talking about how I haven't really seen a lot of scholarship on the subject of sound in early Christianity and patristic scholarship. Um, this is a very unique approach, I think, to a subject that we'll get to as we talk about your book. But before we get into the details of your book, perhaps we can talk a little bit about how you came to this subject. Like what motivated you to write a book on sound in early Christianity?
Yeah, good question. In some ways, this book began a long time ago. I grew up playing the cello, and I actually majored
Mm,
in cello performance as an undergraduate. I shifted gears and started doing early Christianity, and um, when I did a master's at Yale Divinity
mm,
School, and I was in a class actually with Harold Atridge.
mm.
It was Gnostic texts in Coptic, and we were reading Nag Hammadi texts in Coptic, and I was really interested in notions of silence, especially in Valentinian literature.
Mm,
It seemed like there was such an emphasis on silence. Even even the Valentinian dyad, the kind of the second principle is sige, silence. I was really
mm,
interested in that,
mm.
and at the same time, I was also doing a research project on reading practices in antiquity, and I was reading William Johnson's
Oh yeah.
elite. I can't remember what it's called. Elite reading
Yeah,
communities.
elite reading communities. Yeah, in the late
Yeah,
Roman
yeah.
Empire. Yeah.
And
Excellent book.
I was so interested in kind of the I guess reception of textual of text, or the reading of text, and kind of how that looked on the ground. It was much more animated than I'd ever imagined.
Mm,
And I was just thinking about like how would a Valentinian text be received in like a regular community that's just
mm,
very animated in its reception of literature. Like I'm thinking of Egeria
yeah.
in her description of the Christians in Jerusalem, and how they would make such an incredible display of emotion when reading like the the Easter story. And I'm thinking, what would that look like for Sethians or Valentinians who focus so much on silence? Anyway, that idea was kind
Mm,
of percolating in my mind for a while. I ultimately did a PhD at Stanford University, and while I was there, I took a course at UC Berkeley with Susanna Elm
mm,
on City of God.
mm,
And the first few chapters of City of God, I just was really fascinated with how Augustine depicts the sound of the earthly city.
mm.
Like for him, Rome just sounds bad. It felt like everywhere I turned, it was just like, wow, this place is just mayhem, cacophony.
Mhm,
That's kind of one of the defining features of the earthly city is it just sounds bad. And as I
mhm,
read, I just thought, wow, this is the soundscape of the city of God is so fascinating when compared to the earthly city.
mhm.
So I wrote a paper in that class. It was well received, and that turned into one of the chapters of my book. Um, ultimately, I to make the long story short, I ultimately went to a concert at the San Francisco Symphony. My wife was playing in it. She was playing with the San Francisco Symphony at the time, and I was really inspired. I talk about this in the intro by Antonin Dvorak,
Yeah.
the composer who came to the New World and wrote a symphony for the New World to try to capture the soundscape of the Americas.
Mhm,
Um, and that kind of created a blueprint for my book. I wanted to say, what was the soundscape of late antiquity like? What would it have been like to be, a late ancient Antonin Dvorak and be stepping on new soil and experiencing the strange sounds of a
mm,
new world? So,
yeah.
kind of, that's a long-winded answer, I guess, to
Yeah.
where it came from. But all of those elements kind of came together in this book.
You know, it raises a lot of thoughts for me because when I took Greek paleography a couple of years ago, um, I had never really appreciated. You talk about William Johnson and reading practices,
Hmm.
um, and there's this huge. I don't want, maybe not huge, but there's this shift in scholarship on late ancient reading practices. The prior assumption was always that um, reading was done aloud, and now scholars are saying, well, maybe there was some silent reading,
Right.
but still the consensus I think is that the reading was allowed.
Hmm.
Um, you would vocalize the text as you read it, and I never really appreciated the significance of that until I took Greek paleography,
Hmm.
because I it occurred to me, well, it occurred to me because the instructor said it occurred to me, but it also made sense as I learned to read Greek manuscripts that it was almost necessary to read these manuscripts with some kind of vocal intonation, um, and that shapes then how we actually read the manuscripts. Like if I were to try to read, a manuscript of Origin or something, a Byzantine manuscript of one of Origen's texts in the classical Greek, like Erasmian pronunciation, it would be very difficult to do that, because there's all kinds of features in the written text that make that difficult. Whereas if you use like Byzantine and modern Greek, it's so much easier and it helps
Right.
to make sense of the actual text. So that's one thing. Another thing, you talk about like the city.
Uh-huh.
You did your work at Yale and Stanford. I did my PhD in Toronto. Huge city, a lot
Hmm.
of stuff going on, a lot of cacophony. There's jackhammers and other
Right.
kinds of like construction noises going on. There's people in the streets, there's traffic honking constantly. And then you get onto campus and you get to like Queens Park, and there's like it's not quite as loud. You can still hear the hustle and bustle, but
Yeah.
there's a little bit more tranquility to it, like in the heart of the city. Um, and I can't help but think that people like Augustine and Origen and Clement in Alexandria knew that phenomenon very well. That just outside their doors, wherever they were teaching in their schools, there was commotion
Yeah.
that very well might have impacted how they were learning and what they were teaching. Can that guy shut up out there? Can
Yeah,
he
for
turn that
sure.
leaf
For sure.
blower off?
Right. 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 Yeah, it kind of reminds me of that. There's the famous letter by Seneca where he talks about just how loud his apartment in Rome was.
Yeah,
He would go there to just work on being able to concentrate.
yeah.
It was just like a workout for his stoic abilities.
Hmm.
And then he would retreat to the countryside after he tried hard enough to focus. But yeah, these cities were loud, and I do think they certainly shaped the way that their understanding kind of like Augustine's understanding of the sound of the
Hmm.
celestial city, and
Yeah.
certainly just the actual soundscape of the world is informing their theology.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like in some respects, the cacophony of sounds outside, in the city that were perhaps disturbing them were symbolic of the chaos of what they saw as the chaos of the pagan culture,
Mhm.
or probably even in philosophical schools, the chaos of mundane life.
Right.
Whereas here we're in this inner sanctum where we're trying to pursue tranquility and purity of heart. All that stuff out there is kind of interfering, so it does create an opening for ascetic practice
Hmm.
for
Hmm.
sure.
Certainly. I mean, you see this especially, yeah, like in monastic circles,
Hmm.
this
Yeah,
focus on kind of this solitary silence. That's kind of the pinnacle of a lot of monastic lifestyles.
right, right. And your book does get into monasticism quite a bit here in a couple of chapters, or at least in one chapter. Um, but for now, I'll try to frame the book, and I think there's uh, a passage in here in your introduction which helps kind of frame the argument because you talk about this Christianizing soundscape, and you talk about two distinct phenomena that emerge in the fourth century that kind of give rise to this, what you call a visceral piety. You talk about two movements, the emergence of imperial Christianity and an emphasis on the incarnation. Fourth century, you get all kinds of Trinitarian and Christological debates going on, and a lot of literature focuses on this incarnation, the embodiment of the eternal Son. And you say these quote, resulted in Christians embracing a new visceral piety that manifested itself in experiences with the physical senses, such as pilgrimage, relic culture, the flourishing of art and architecture, the notion of a holy land, the enrichment of liturgy, and more. And of course, you refer to what scholars here call the material turn.
Hmm.
So um, it really starts with Christ, you say, or at least these authors say this changing soundscape starts with Christ. But as that's being negotiated, it really finds its full expression after the Constantinian um, revolution, as you call it. Take us through that insight, the pre-Constantinian church and the pagan world, and then how Constantine and the Constantinian Empire, the Christianizing of the empire, uh, affects these what you call soundscapes. And maybe you can talk a little bit too about what you mean by soundscape.
Yeah. So, well, yeah, soundscape is just simply the natural and unnatural uh, landscape of sound. It's
Mm-hmm.
just kind of the how does the world sound out there,
Mm-hmm.
um, and how does it express itself pre-Constantine? I think you have ideas like you see in Ignatius, for instance. He talks about how Ignatius of Antioch. He talks about how uh, at Jesus's birth, there's a new star that appears, right? And he describes how, and I'm forgetting the reference. I think it's in his letter to the Ephesians. He describes how the cosmos kind of reorients itself around this new star. And for us, that's like okay, that's cool. But if you have this
Mm-hmm.
idea um, where if you're believing in the music of the spheres or the musica universalis, which is a lot of ancient people, which is essentially that the cosmos make a sound
Mm-hmm.
that we're kind of in this the cosmos is kind of like an instrument and it's all tuned together and the movement of the stars and the planets those make sounds whether you can hear them or not
Mm-hmm.
there's it's kind of like we're in a large instrument. Well, if you actually transformed that, you'd be kind of like retuning the entire cosmos,
Yeah.
right? And I think that's what's at stake with Ignatius
Mm-hmm.
saying this. It's not just like a cool, celestial expression. It's more like, wow, the entire cosmos is kind of reoriented itself. Um, and so that statement, you also have like with Clement of Alexandria, he talks about how kind of the original creation was almost kind of in tune in a way, but with what happens in Eden, you have this kind of it falls out of tune. He even uses language drawn from music, and what Christ does is he kind of comes and retunes it in a way. And so you have these ideas kind of percolating pre-Constantine that Christ is someone at his advent who kind of transforms the way that the cosmos is structured, and a lot of this is imagined through um, like musical imagery and especially using the idea from Plato and others of the music of the spheres and kind of
Mm-hmm.
it's being recalibrated before it's kind of out of tune with sin, and that's where you get like the sounds of the earthly city. I think Augustine's drawing on this idea too, but with Christ things are being brought back together. But what you have with Constantine, it's kind of like when Christians are enfranchised, now they're able to kind of almost finish the job that Christ commenced. Um, and I show in chapter one or in chapter two,
Mm-hmm.
chapter one, sorry, that Christians in this time, they're kind of giving all the credit to Christ, like all these sounds of Christianization, where we're destroying paganism. These pagan temples are being, thrown, overthrown, and the landscaping's being filled with the sounds of the Psalms and the
Yeah.
sounds of liturgy. This all began with Christ, and it's just kind of, you know, we're just kind of finishing the job in a sense. But I think that's my major argument in the book is that Christians they imagine Christ as someone who transforms the soundscape of the world, and that they're in the endeavor of kind of completing that, bringing that to completion, as they go, you know, spread Christianity and Christianize institutions.
Well, I'm not, I really don't know anything about astrophysics, but if I'm not mistaken, um, don't astrophysicists say that um, the planets and the stars emit some kind of sound? I mean, they're not completely si I thought I heard that somewhere. Like you can detect some kind of sound emitting.
Yeah, and you're outside my realm, but
Yeah.
yeah, I mean,
Well,
I don't know. I just don't know.
I'm sure somebody watching this will fact check me and tell
Yeah.
me that I'm being delusional, but I swear I thought I heard that somewhere. But then again, like I said, I don't know a damn thing about astrophysics.
Neither do
Um, okay. So there was something here. You talked about giving credit to Christ, and there
I.
was something I thought I marked it where um, you talk about Christ on the cross. Where was that now? Okay, let's see here. Okay, here. This is on page 29.
Okay.
Quote. So you talk about Christ defeating these pagan gods, these
Mm-hmm.
pagan demonic forces. Quote, "It is sound that conveys defeat. With his loud cry, Christ ushered in this raucous destruction of demonic reign. The sound of idolatry ceased, while the crumbling noise of demolition took its place. Then, shortly thereafter, the sweet sounds of liturgy filled the air where the debauched songs of paganism used to resound." End quote. That's quite interesting, because this loud cry, if I'm not, well, I'm trying to think. Um, it ushered in a silence, right? But the silence that it brought was the silence of these pagan gods
Yeah.
that Christ kind of shut up. And then with out of that silence emerged this new Christian harmony. And you bring this out in your book, how they understood this as sort of bringing and restoring an order out of the chaos of the pagan world. Is that somewhat accurate to kind of
Yeah,
describe what's
yeah,
going on?
and what you're summarizing here is the views of Jacob of Sarug in his
Sarug, yeah,
On the
right.
Fall of Idols. Yeah, and he describes kind of this the destruction of idols and paganism in his day. It's kind of beginning with Christ,
Hmm.
where it's this cry of Christ on the cross, and all of these idols are kind of they're kind of the demolition of them.
Hmm.
It kind of ensues. You see a similar thing I reference here with Eusebius, where he talks about the death of Pan, the god Pan, and he
Hmm.
he uses that to understand the Pan referring to Greek, the Greek word Pan, all, saying
Hmm.
that that Christ actually in his life is the one who ushered in the death of all gods. And actually, you can read about this in non-Christian sources. Eusebius
Hmm.
says.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, and so Christians are kind of they're attributing this Christianization of late antiquity. They're saying this began with Christ, and what you're seeing now is kind of a protracted fulfillment of it. But this is all something that Jesus began in his life.
So that's the pro. Well, Sarug, I don't know his dates exactly. What is he fifth, sixth century? I can't. He's a bit
Yeah,
later, isn't he?
yeah. He's so we have 451 to 521
Four,
here.
okay, yeah, that's kind of about what I thought. So he's he's a little bit later than these earlier figures, these
Yeah.
pre-Constantinian figures. How do the pre-Constantinian figures navigate this issue? Because we have you talk about this a little bit. Um, they had an understanding of the senses for sure.
Hmm.
Um, but they were also concerned that sense perception can be deceptive
Right.
and it can lead to idolatry. So how do they address that issue at all? I think you do talk about that in here.
Yeah, I mean, the traditional narrative of that is kind of that you have with Origin, for instance, like the emergence of the spiritual senses,
Hmm.
where kind of he's divorcing the physical senses from the spiritual senses because the physical senses can be, deceptive. Now, there's been recent work on this that show that Origin's not actually the initiator of this idea; that it actually you could trace it way back. So Jane Heath has done really good work on this,
Hmm.
um, showing that Christians, at least from the second century, and I think she even traces it to Paul, saying, "Hey, there's this kind of idea of the spiritual senses really early on that differentiate the spiritual senses as receptors of truth, um,
Hmm.
that are ontologically different from the physical senses."
Hmm.
Um, and I think that's a very that's a dominant view,
Hmm.
is that you have like two sets of senses, and in that way you can devalue the physical senses. Now the traditional idea is that with Constantine, that transforms. You have like as Christianity becomes public and more visceral in its piety, then you have you have expressions of piety that are more material, right? And this is what we call the sensory turn, the material turn.
Hmm.
Um, Now, I would push back a little bit on that
Yeah.
narrative because you have people like Tertullian who are saying that you can't. There's no such thing as spiritual senses. Like if you devalue the physical senses, then you're devaluing the incarnation itself, and you can't actually have two different channels of perception. Otherwise, you put Christ's fleshiness into question, and his entire incarnation. So I think to answer your question, pre Constantine, I think you have a lot of different ideas of how to make sense of this. But I do think a major trend is this kind of spiritual senses discourse,
Yeah.
where you're understanding divinity outside of the physical senses.
Mhm. Yeah. So I wrote my dissertation on Origen's homilies on the Psalms, and I'm trying to think now. Um, I can't remember which one it is. It's one of his homilies, I think, on Psalms. I want to say 76. If it's his third homily on 76 or something, I can't remember. But the lemma, the verse that starts the entire homily, is uh, a voice of your thunder was in the circuit. That's the Septuagint reading of Psalm 76 or 77. Um, and Origen says, what the hell does this even mean? Um, and he starts with this very beautiful meditation on how, if I recall correctly, now I might get some details wrong, but he starts with this beautiful meditation on how God uses different instruments to rouse us from our sleep.
Mm-hmm.
And he says some of those instruments are, music,
Mm-hmm.
um, music and the arts. And he warns, though, that if we take them, the music and the arts, as you know, as goods in themselves, as opposed to instruments that God is using to rouse us, then we can be led kind of into idolatry.
Right.
So I think even the take with Origin on the spiritual senses, divorced from the physical, is even somewhat misleading. Origin certainly sees an integrity to the physical senses,
Right.
but scripture will often speak of physical organs as references to the spiritual organs.
Mm-hmm.
And he uses Matthew 5:8 there, purity of heart. And he says, this is an example of scripture's use of homonymy, where it's using the term heart, not in the sense of the physical organ or muscle,
Right.
but in the sense of the intellectual organ, this organ of spiritual perception. So I think even in that, I think Origen is a little bit more sympathetic to the physical senses, but he does worry that if we don't keep a keen eye on them and use sharp discernment, we can kind of be led. We can be led into thinking these musical festivals that the pagans are doing are goods in themselves, rather than um, seeing harmony as a product of God's harmonious work.
Yeah, I agree, and I think one of the struggles I actually had writing like a narrative like that is that I do agree with you 100% that Origin in some scholarship of the spiritual senses is
Mhm.
he's kind of oversimplified, right? Like he's just clearly like anti-physical senses. But
Yeah,
it's not just Origin, it's also the period before Constantine. It's all
yeah,
sort of like they experienced God outside of the physical senses. And I read that
hmm
over and over again in different sources, and I thought, man, that's that just seems overly simplistic. And that's
yeah,
people often say that so that then after we can draw a clear distinction between pre-Constantine, post-Constantine.
yeah,
Post-Constantine, it's very much a physical, visceral. It's the sensory turn.
yeah.
Um,
That's right.
and so, in order to have that, you need to kind of create this really dark background of no sensory experience. But yeah, I do think
Yeah.
it's an oversimplified narrative.
It is a bit of like a rhetorical narrative that helps
Mhm.
set up
Yeah,
what happens in the fourth century. And there's a lot that happens. Although I think there was some, I don't know if there would be like relic veneration, but there are early writers pre-Constantine who do talk, I think, about um, you know, the tombs of martyrs,
yeah. I
but
mean,
nothing really quite as developed as the post-Constantinian
right,
period.
right. And so, I mean, you have like something like Martyrdom of Polycarp,
Yeah.
where at the end they're worshiping. Actually, sometimes people say it's bones, but it's actually not his bones. It's actually the place. But there is this kind of um, movement toward veneration of martyrs, and
hmm
something that we often associate with post Constantine. And you're right; it's kind of a rhetorical move. We try to kind of really draw a clear line in the sand
Yeah.
between pre and post, and sometimes we do that at the cost of kind of the things how they really were on the ground.
Right. Well, in your, is it first chapter now? I'm thinking it's first chapter. Um, yes. Okay. So your first chapter, you talk about Christmas and
Mm-hmm.
uh, the changing effect Christmas had on the soundscape. Talk a little bit about that. That's very interesting. Not too many people talk about um, the rise of Christmas as a festal celebration.
Yeah, so Christmas has kind of interesting. I always heard before I did any of this research that Christmas is just simply stems from pagan origins, and
hmm
it's just kind of Saturnalia, Christianized essentially. But the evidence for that is actually not strong at all. So there's a German scholar, and I'm forgetting his first name, but his last name is Forster, and he's done good work on showing that um, actually this probably, at least I'm pretty convinced by him, that Christmas actually stems from Christian um, attempts to kind of identify the birth of Christ and celebrate him on his birthday, essentially.
hmm
It's not really, it doesn't really have pagan origins. Anyway, that's neither here nor there.
hmm
What you see is, especially in the fourth century, as Christmas kind of emerges, you see an emphasis particularly on light in Christmas orations and homilies. Because, I mean, it's obvious, right? Christmas is at the darkest time of year, and it's kind of this idea that Christ is born at the darkest time of year. And after his birth, there's increased light. Um, and you can see why Christians make that emphasis. In fact, at this at this time, well, pre-Constantine, the winter solstice was December 25th, not
hmm
December 21st, and that's so it coincided exactly on Christmas. Um, anyway, so there's a real emphasis on light, but I show actually, as no one has ever seen before, there's an equal emphasis on sound. They imagine that Christ, it's not just that his birth brought new light, but also brought new sound. The cry of his birth, right, or of the baby crying, like Ephraim talks about, it initiates this kind of new era of sound that grows and grows until the earth is Christianized with this sound. So yeah, Um, that was an interesting
Yeah.
topic to kind of study. And I found it really interesting going back through a lot of these early Christian homilies, like some of the earliest Christmas literature. Um, yeah, and so that's kind of my argument with
Yeah.
that.
No, it's very interesting. I think this might be the first book of scholarship on early Christianity where I've seen an extended discussion of the origins of Christmas
Wow.
and its importance. That was quite interesting. So um, I was thinking it was quite appropriate too because we just had some pretty significant snowfall here recently in Minnesota.
Yeah,
And I thought, oh my God, it's not Christmas season. This is April.
yeah.
Give me a
Those are the
break.
those are the most depressing
It
snowstorms.
really is. It
In
really
April
is.
one, sometimes you get them in May too. In Utah, you get them in May.
Oh man, it's terrible. Yeah, we get snow here in May too sometimes, and I have to wonder, where are you?
Yeah, right.
Where are you? Help a brother out here.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, personally, with my interest also in monasticism, you talk about the chanting of the Psalms
Mhm.
and a couple of different contexts where you bring up Egyptian monastic. You got the life of Antony,
Yeah.
and then you've got Athanasius's beautiful letter to Marcellinus, where he talks about, we chant the Psalms, bringing kind of rhythm and harmony to our soul, healing the soul of its passions. I think Evagrius it's either in the Practicos or in his short little treatise on prayer. I can't remember where, but he talks about psalmody as kind of getting the soul into a condition to
Mhm.
be kind of uh, tranquil, so that it can be a receptacle of God's illumination. Where does psalmody and the Christian soundscape talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, this was probably actually my favorite chapter to write. Um, I first off, the letter to Marcellinus, I think is an incredible
And you're
piece.
right. It doesn't get studied enough, I don't
It does
think,
not.
as a text in itself. No,
I
I
mean,
think you're
it was
right.
translated so early on. We have so many manuscripts of it. It's translated into Latin and Syriac really early on, and it informs the way people understand how the Psalms, what the Psalms mean
Yeah.
from the fourth century onward, so broadly that I mean, it's very much understudied.
And it's
Um,
included in Codex Alexandrinus, which you bring
yeah,
up.
yeah.
That tells you something about the way it was received and how perhaps the readers of that codex used it as an aid for their own reading and meditation of the
Yeah.
Psalms.
And that work is kind of what was the foundation for my argument in chapter 4
Mm,
about the Psalms. So most scholarship on the Psalms, I think is really good, showing how the Psalms are tools to kind of soothe the self
mhm,
and um, exercise like inner demons, really kind of
mhm.
balance the self and transform it into something that mirrors God in a better way. That said, my argument shows that that's only really half the story. The Psalms are not just things to exercise inner demons, but actually also external demons.
External, yeah.
So I show how demonology in this era is not something where demons are simply just afflicting the
Yeah,
individual, but they occupy space.
yeah.
They're locative entities. They live out there. And so you have something like the life of Antony. He advances further and further into the desert, and he's encroaching on their territory. This isn't just a struggle with himself. Like it is
Yeah.
also that.
He goes out to
But
do battle with demons.
yeah,
That's what he
this is a
does.
land dispute. Like
Yeah.
he's trying to get out there
Yeah.
and conquer the land for Jesus. And how does he
Yeah.
do that? He does it with the Psalms.
Hmm.
And I think a central part of this is what Athanasius talks about, but also a host of late ancient writers describe the Psalms as the vox Christi, the voice of Christ.
Hmm.
In fact, Athanasius writes that a tupos of Christ, his tupos, his his type, I guess you could say,
Hmm.
is uh, is actually contained in the Psalms. Like in a way, the Psalms were almost like an aural incarnation before his physical
Hmm.
incarnation. Like they
Yeah.
contain the actual voice of Christ, and when he talks about it, if you perform it in the right way, That's how you get the voice of Christ kind of present, and that's what's going to cast the demons out.
Yeah.
So, and that's why in Letter to Marcellinus, he's very very particular in how it's being performed. Like you can't do this in your own way. If you want the voice of Christ to come out of this and drive demons out, you have to do it in the way I prescribe here. And his vision again is not just about transforming the individual monastic or individual Christian. It's about claiming land
Yeah.
and rooting demons out of their strongholds so we can actually Christianize the world.
Yeah, and you bring this up too. Evagrius has that wonderful little treatise, Antiridicos,
Yeah.
um, where he's got a short biblical verse. I don't know how many, I can't remember how many of them, 100 and something. I don't know. Is there 180, 190? I don't remember how many of individual verses. A lot of them are from the Psalms. And the purpose
Yeah.
of these is the monk would, if being attacked by a particular demon, which again, as you say, for these individuals was quite real, might
Yeah.
not have been flesh and blood, but it was a material, some kind of material substance. You would hurl this verse at the demon. And
Yeah.
again, a lot of these, I don't know what proportion, but a lot of them were passages from the Psalter.
Yeah, and I forget the numbers, but I have here some sort of it's the vast majority of them. Like scripture is important, and people often talk about this too in Life of Antony. Scripture is central to his battle with demons, but it's not just scripture; it's the Psalms in particular.
Yeah.
And it's like Athanasius teaches in his letter to Marcellinus. The Psalms contain this kind of the voice of Christ, and they have the entirety of human experience within them. It says, and
Hmm.
it's a different type of text. It's not just like it's very different from Deuteronomy or other biblical texts. Like the Psalms have this particular power to cast out demons. You see this
Hmm.
also in Jewish literature of the time
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
material evidence. It's not just they're not just drawing on any it's not any scripture will do. It's vast majority of the time it's Psalms, particularly Psalm 91, where
Hmm.
it talks about kind of casting them out and claiming new land.
Well, you talk about this too. When I was at the British Library in 2019, um, I wanted to go see Codex Sinaiticus,
Mm-hmm.
and I did, and it was just a magnificent text, or the fragment that they have of it there. But they also had this little amulet, and on papyrus, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was a papyrus amulet, and it was a little prayer for protection
Uh-huh.
for somebody who is going on a journey somewhere,
Yeah.
presumably through the desert or something. And I think I want to say it was a verse from a psalm.
Mm-hmm.
But even if that particular one wasn't, you talking here about how um, there are a lot of amulets from the period that contain text from the Psalms as a means of protection against the evil spirits. So yeah, words have meanings. Words are infused with meaning, but the biblical text particular, and even the Psalms more particular, possess some kind of divine power that warded the demons off.
Yeah. Yeah, and you see this all the way back even with Tertullian, right? Where, but I mean, you see this in the Dead Sea Scrolls as well. I mean, the
Yeah,
Psalms are kind of the, uh, they're kind of the ultimate artillery against demons. I
yeah.
mean, Jesus also quotes Psalms, in the Temptations. Like the Psalms are central to kind of combating demons in antiquity, and you see this in early Christianity, especially in Athanasius as well.
You know, I'm probably getting my texts mixed up here, but it's making me think of Cashin, John Cashin.
Mm,
And it's somewhere in his conferences. He talks about in a couple of different places. So I might be getting these mixed up. But I think it's either in Conference 14, which is on spiritual knowledge,
hmm
or Conference 10, which is the second conference on prayer. He's talking, um, or um, or his friend, like I can't remember his friend's name now, who's talking to the Abba during one of these conferences, and he says, during the chanting of the Psalms, I'm I keep getting bombarded with these memories of the pagan poets.
Mm.
And he's asking you like what do I do? And I think this is where the Abba says, um, uh, cite the words, uh, "O God, come to my assistance, Lord, make haste to help me," which is from Psalm. I don't remember which one now. Um,
But
so,
Anthony quotes that same psalm, and I'm forgetting which one it is too.
yeah, so that verse, it's so okay. So this psalmody is a spiritual remedy on the one hand, and it's one of its uses, a spiritual remedy to balance your soul and to kind of bring some kind of tranquility to it. And but even during that time, this is something Origin talks about too, is like during at the time of prayer, this is when the demons really try to attack and
Yeah,
try to drag you away. And what's this monk's um suggestion for fixing that? You throw this biblical verse at them. You know, God come to my assistance, Lord make haste to help me. So the Psalter, spiritual battleground, an opportunity for the demons to attack, but also the remedy.
yeah,
It's quite interesting, but it makes I think it confirms for me part of your point because a lot of these individuals, you know, the traditional scholarship for a long time said these monks were largely illiterate,
mm,
anti-intellectual, but then you get a lot of them like Evagrius and Cassian who were very literate and very well read in the classics. And so for these kinds of monks, when you're chanting the Psalms, which is scriptural poetry, it's an opportunity for the demons to kind of attack and say, these are the poems you should be reading. Remember
yeah,
Homer and Menander and all these things. And it's like,
yeah.
that's a conflict.
Yeah, I think the psalms are they're a threat to
Yeah.
both at the kind of the individual level, but also at the larger level. I mean, my chapter is actually called "Battle of the Bands" because
Hmm.
I make the argument that on the one hand you have Christians singing the psalms, but in reaction you have a lot of these demons making these kind of dissonant, cacophonous sounds,
Hmm.
both to try to distract the monks, which has been well documented in scholarship, but also it kind of demonstrates their distress at losing power and losing their ground. It's kind of like I mean, it's just a sound of warfare essentially, and it's supposed to be intimidating for Christians, but it also just indicates that their territory is being encroached upon. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Dervis Chitty has this really great book, The Desert, the City.
Mm,
Um, and he's talking about how these monks, you know, led by Antony, turned this deserted region into this beautiful kind of city
mm,
of city of God, basically, with all these monks. I don't know if he talks about this at all in there, but you have to think, like, in light of your book, their chanting of the so you think there's monks everywhere, you know, and the chanting of the Psalms, you know, that's music, right? That's they're creating sound. And where are they doing it? They're in this desert, which was the place of the dead, you know, the
yes.
place where the demons particularly lived. So them chanting the Psalms was in some way trying to bring musical harmony, an order of sound to this place that was chaotic sound.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, and that's really like I think again the best example of that is Life of Antony,
Yeah,
right?
right.
It's the end of it is it's not just that Anthony kind of makes his way there, but he also kind of establishes. It says he establishes a city there, and they're in harmony together now. They're singing the psalms in the desert, and they've made they've made the habitation of deserts into a totally new soundscape
Mhm.
of heaven.
So maybe I'll finish with the subject of your last chapter, Augustine. So you've talked a little bit about Augustine so far,
Mm-hmm.
but take us through Augustine's contribution to this changing soundscape.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, I was interested in kind of the soundscape of the earthly city, that it's just dissonance. It sounds bad. That's kind of just his. He says this in different ways throughout the first 5 chapters of City of God, but that's just the
Mm,
real takeaway that I got. And then the City of God obviously sounds good, but it actually doesn't really sound like anything. It's a place of pure silence. But Augustine doesn't tell Christians to espouse silence right away necessarily. He um, he advocates what he calls jubilus or jubilatio, which is jubilation. He wants
Mhm.
Christians to, instead of worrying about rhetoric or speaking correctly like you find in the earthly city,
Mhm.
it's about letting the spirit kind of erupt out of you and produce sounds that for a Roman would sound wild and crazy.
Mhm.
Stuff like you find, he mentions this in chapter 22 of the City of God, where he's talking about the cult of the saints, and there it's kind of people are overwhelmed by the spirit, and there's crazy, in the eyes of Romans, crazy sounds. I mean, it's very wild.
Mhm.
It's unrestrained spiritual jubilation, and that is kind of his contribution. He's saying, look, let's when you focus on rhetoric and sounding correctly, which is what all of these Roman and Greek writers are doing, it actually ends up in dissonance and cacophony.
Mhm.
There are sometimes you can have individual writers might sound good. In fact, he talks about the gospel writers, and the first time he encountered them, they didn't have the sophistication of language. But when you put them together, their ideas clash so much, and the output of their ideas is just dissonance.
Mhm.
Whereas Christianity brings a totally new soundscape. It's a new city built on new sounds, and it's a celestial city. Well,
Mhm.
actually, one last thing on that.
Mhm.
One of the most interesting things that he teaches is about the origin of the Book of John, the Gospel of John. So he says that that originated when John was having the Last Supper with Jesus, and he leaned on Jesus' breast and let out a belch.
Yeah. Yeah, you
And
have
that
that. You talk a
belch,
lot about belching in here. That's funny.
yeah. And so, I mean, even belching,
Yeah.
that's a belching of jubilation,
Yeah.
right? That's how this new society should be, where you're kind of belching out the spirit in a way, right? Rather than being like a Cicero type exact wording, which ultimately leads to warfare and destruction.
Mhm. Yeah. Huh. Well, a theme I think that is in your book. I don't know if you get into it much, but it seems to me that the the spectrum or the continuum that these writers are trying to navigate is what we would call, the on one end of the spectrum, you've got apophaticism, which
Mm.
is like
Yep.
complete darkness and unknowing God and silence, lack of sense perception, basically no sense perception at all.
Yep.
And then you have the cataphatic tradition, which is, really knowing God through sense perception and expressing it through
Mhm.
sense perception in a very positive sense. It seems like most of these writers are trying to navigate, like, okay, so Evagrius would probably be towards the far end of the spectrum on the apophatic side. He talked about imageless
Yeah.
prayer, but I don't think he's quite extreme in his apophaticism because he's got like this saphiric light that he talks about. So there is some sense experience. But then on the other end, on the cataphatic side, he got like who would be a good representation of that? Diaticus of Photiki maybe, or uh, the oh, what's his name? Those homilies, the pseudo-Macarian homilies,
Mhm.
which are alive with a lot of like sense perception language.
Mhm.
Um, so where would you put then like someone like Augustine in that? Is he more apophatic? Is he cataphatic? Like how would you describe him in that
Yeah, he's
regard?
kind of an interesting place, right? Because he does emphasize the kind of the silence of the word, right? And in heaven they actually don't use words. It's a realm beyond,
Mhm.
sound is something that is it takes place in time,
Mhm.
right? And so you're beyond time, and so it has to be
Yeah.
this silent realm. And yet at the same time, he says, look, we're not there yet. Like we are. the best approximation of that is jubilation, right? And
Mm,
having the spirit kind of erupt these sounds and singing the psalms because they're simple and they can be learned by all people, and not singing the learned verse of paganism.
yeah.
So in some ways, I think he's kind of apophatic, but also he's kind of cataphatic in a way.
Mm,
He's kind of like a practical uh,
yeah. He's
cataphatic, I guess you could say.
yeah, okay. Okay, that's interesting. So he's probably got sympathies for both sides.
Yeah.
Us Catholics, we like to talk about the great both and.
Mm-hmm.
We're we're not either or. We're both and. We kind of like to have both ends of the spectrum accounted for. So
Yeah.
Augustine seems, according to you, would kind of fit
Yeah, I would say he's a
nicely
both
into
man.
that category.
I think that's a
Yeah.
nice way of
Yeah.
yeah, describing him.
Okay. Well, I highly recommend this book, Sounds for a New World, the Christianizing Soundscapes of Late Antiquity. Dr. Abbott, thank you very much for being a guest on PatristiCast today.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Until next time, I will see you all later.